3 states, 3 laws, 3 sets of eyes, and none of them could see the whole picture. That was the point. That line, attributed to Darius Redmond by a federal cooperating witness who sat across from him in a private meeting sometime in 1995, tells you everything you need to know about how this man thought. Not as a street hustler, not as a corner boy who got lucky, but as a strategist. A man who looked at a map the way other men look at a chessboard and saw not boundaries, but blind spots. The question that hangs over a story like this is not simply how a person builds something illegal on such a scale. The deeper question is what kind of mind looks at a broken system, at bureaucratic gaps and jurisdictional fault lines, and decides that those gaps are not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to be seized. How far will a human being go when they convince themselves that geography itself is on their side? Shreveport, Louisiana. In the early 1990s was a city caught between what it used to be and what it was slowly becoming. The downtown riverfront, once animated by the kind of commerce that made the city feel like a legitimate regional capital, had grown quieter. The casinos hadn't yet arrived in full force. The oil money that had briefly pumped through the area in the 70s and early 80s had receded, leaving behind a particular kind of economic emptiness that cities like this know well, the kind where the buildings are still standing, but the purpose inside them has drained away. On summer mornings, Cedar Grove and Allendale woke up to the sound of screen doors and distant traffic on I-20. Kids played in driveways. Women walked to bus stops. Men sat on porches in the thick Louisiana heat that arrives before 9 in the morning and doesn't leave until well after dark. There was a surface rhythm to life in these neighborhoods, a tired normalcy, and underneath it, moving with the same quiet consistency as water through a cracked foundation, was the infrastructure Darius Redmond was building. Redmond was born in Shreveport in 1966. By the time his story intersects with federal case records, he is a grown man with an established reputation and a deliberate personal mythology. But the contours of his earlier life matter because they explain the shape of his thinking. He grew up in a household acquainted with scarcity, the kind of working poor environment where intelligence doesn't translate into opportunity without a specific kind of luck or connection that most people in those zip codes simply never encounter. People who knew him as a young man described him consistently in the same terms: quiet, observant, rarely impulsive. A man who listened more than he spoke. His childhood friends would later recall that Darius was the one who always seemed to be calculating something, even in the middle of conversation. Not dishonestly, not yet, but with a restless precision that had no obvious outlet in the economy available to him. By his mid-20s, Redmond had absorbed what Shreveport's geography meant in practical terms. The city sits almost exactly at the point where Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas converge. Interstate 20 runs east-west through the heart of it. Interstate 49 moves north into Arkansas. US 79 pushes northwest toward Texarkana. Shreveport was not just a city. It was a transit node, a natural waypoint for goods, people, and supply chains moving between the Gulf Coast, the interior South, and the Southwest corridor. Redmond didn't just understand this abstractly. He understood it operationally. He understood that drugs moving out of Houston toward Memphis, or moving up from New Orleans toward Little Rock, passed through or near his city by geographic necessity. And he understood, this is the part that separates him from ordinary street-level dealers, that Louisiana State Police, Arkansas State Police, and Texas DPS operated in largely separate intelligence environments. They shared almost nothing. They had no unified database. A seizure in Bossier City did not automatically produce an alert in Texarkana. A confidential informant working for the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office knew nothing about the network being monitored by DEA out of Dallas. The seams were real, and Darius Redmond built his organization directly into those seams. What he constructed between roughly 1991 and 1998 was not, at its core, a street-level retail operation. That distinction matters enormously. Redmond was a wholesaler. His organization functioned as a distribution hub, receiving large quantities of cocaine and, later, crack cocaine from supply chains rooted in the Gulf Coast and Southwest Texas corridors, then breaking those quantities into wholesale lots that were sold to street-level organizations operating in northwestern Louisiana, southwestern Arkansas, and northeastern Texas. His customers were not individual users. They were other organizations, other networks, other mid-level operators who took his supply and moved it through their own retail chains. This insulated Redmond from direct street exposure. It put layers between him and the physical transactions that most often generate arrests. And it meant that when individual street organizations got hit by local law enforcement, as they periodically did, they had supply relationships with a Shreveport-based wholesaler that no single state agency had yet assembled into a coherent picture. The people who worked closest to Redmond described an operation that ran with a discipline unusual for its era. There were no unnecessary conversations. There was a rigid principle against conducting business in vehicles or locations that had already been associated with prior arrests. Redmond maintained what associates would later describe as a strict separation between his visible life, which included legitimate business activity and a community-facing social presence, and the logistical core of his distribution network. He was known in certain Shreveport social circles. He attended community events. He was, by surface appearances, a man of modest but stable means. This was not accidental. It was managed image, and the management of that image became one of the central threads that investigators would eventually pull. The first serious law enforcement attention Redmond attracted came not from a coordinated investigation, but from a series of overlapping coincidences. In 1993, a mid-level distributor in Texarkana, Arkansas, a man named Calvin Pryor, who was later identified as one of Redmond's regular wholesale customers, was arrested following a traffic stop that produced approximately 4 kilograms of cocaine. The arresting agency was the Miller County Sheriff's Office. Standard procedure produced a cooperation offer. Pryor was not immediately forthcoming about his supply source. This was common. But in the months following his arrest, investigators noticed that the cocaine that had passed through Pryor's network carried a chemical signature consistent with supply being tracked by DEA in the Houston corridor. That signature became a thread. It was thin, and no one yet knew where it led. But it existed. Around the same time, a DEA analyst working out of the Shreveport resident office began accumulating what she would later describe in court testimony as a pattern of absence, meaning a pattern of drug activity in the region that seemed to have a consistent wholesale source that was somehow never appearing in any arrest record or informant report. The cocaine was moving. The organizations buying it were identifiable, but the supply relationship, the upstream connection, kept terminating at a wall. Every chain of inquiry that should have led to a supplier instead led to a transaction that had already been completed, a contact whose phone number was no longer active, or a description so vague as to be operationally useless. In her notes, she wrote a single line that would later be quoted during the federal trial. Someone is supplying the supply chain, and they are doing it without leaving a fingerprint. By 1994, Redmond's operation had expanded its wholesale relationships to include at least 6 separate street organizations across the 3-state area. Federal investigators, now beginning to coordinate more seriously, though still imperfectly, estimated that the distribution network was moving between 15 and 20 kilograms of cocaine per month at peak volume. These are conservative figures drawn from the eventual indictment and the testimony of cooperating witnesses. The revenue generated was substantial, and Redmond's management of that revenue was itself a subject of later prosecution. Money moved through a combination of cash-intensive small businesses, informal loan arrangements, and what investigators described as a deliberate strategy of keeping individual transactions below thresholds that would trigger financial reporting requirements. The contradictions began accumulating publicly in 1995 when Redmond gave a voluntary interview to a Shreveport television news segment about economic development in Cedar Grove. He spoke articulately about community investment and legitimate business. He presented himself as a man with interests in local commerce, a man invested in the neighborhood's future. It was a confident performance, perhaps too confident. Federal investigators who later reviewed the segment noted the timing. The interview was given approximately 3 weeks after a significant cocaine shipment had passed through Shreveport en route to distribution customers in all 3 states. The comfort with which Redmond occupied a public-facing identity while managing a concealed operation was striking. It wasn't recklessness. It was the expression of a man who had convinced himself genuinely that the two worlds could never intersect. The first major contradiction that would later surface in court involved telephone records. Redmond had consistently maintained, in conversations with associates and, eventually, in pre-trial statements, that his contact with Calvin Pryor was limited to a brief social acquaintance from years earlier, and that the two men had no ongoing relationship. The telephone records told a different story. Subpoenaed records showed more than 40 documented calls between numbers associated with Redmond's operation and numbers associated with Pryor's network in the 14 months preceding Pryor's 1993 arrest. 40 calls. The calls were short, often under 2 minutes, and they clustered in patterns that investigators identified as consistent with supply coordination rather than social contact. When confronted with this discrepancy through his attorney in pre-trial proceedings, Redmond's position shifted. The calls had occurred, but their content was unrelated to drug activity. The explanation was offered without supporting detail, and without any account of what 40 brief, clustered calls between two men who were supposedly casual acquaintances might actually have concerned. The second contradiction involved the physical infrastructure of his operation. A storage facility rented under a third-party name in Bossier City, just across the Red River from Shreveport, was connected to Redmond through a paper trail that took investigators nearly a year to fully reconstruct. The facility had been used, according to cooperating witness testimony, as a transshipment point where wholesale quantities were staged before distribution to out-of-state buyers. Redmond denied any knowledge of or connection to the facility. But a fingerprint recovered from inside a secondary storage locker within the facility matched Redmond's prints on file from a prior unrelated matter. One print. It was not on packaging. It was not on product. It was on the interior wall of the locker, at a height consistent with someone reaching upward to check or access the locker's upper shelf. One print in a room that, according to the renting party, Redmond had never visited and had no reason to enter. The third and most consequential contradiction involved a cooperating witness who, by the time of his decision to cooperate in 1996, had been a mid-level logistics coordinator within Redmond's distribution network for approximately 3 years. This individual, whose identity remained protected through the trial and whose cooperation was managed by a joint DEA and FBI task force, provided detailed chronological accounts of the operation's mechanics, the supply channels, the pricing structures, the communication protocols, the geographic routing of shipments, and the decision-making hierarchy. What made his testimony particularly damaging was its specificity regarding conversations he had directly with Redmond. Conversations in which Redmond had described in explicit terms his understanding of the jurisdictional gap between the 3 state law enforcement agencies and his deliberate construction of the distribution network to exploit that gap. The cooperating witness recalled Redmond explaining, during a private meeting, that the key to sustained operation was ensuring that no single agency ever accumulated enough complete information to build a prosecutable case. Keep the transactions distributed. Keep the supply relationships compartmentalized. Keep the geography working in your favor. When the defense challenged the cooperating witness's credibility, as defense counsel was obligated to do, and did vigorously, the government's response was to demonstrate corroboration on more than 24 specific factual claims the witness had made. Dates, locations, transaction sizes, phone numbers, vehicle descriptions, and logistical details were each individually cross-referenced against independent evidence. Telephone records, surveillance photographs, financial documents, and the testimony of additional cooperating witnesses. The corroboration was not perfect. It rarely is. But its breadth made the credibility challenge difficult to sustain before the jury. The coordination required to bring the case to prosecution was itself a measure of what Redmond had achieved. The eventual indictment required parallel engagement from the U.S. Attorney's offices in the Western District of Louisiana, the Western District of Arkansas, and the Eastern District of Texas. These three offices had to agree on charging strategy, on the allocation of prosecutorial responsibility, and on how the evidence developed in each district would be consolidated into a single overarching conspiracy case. Federal prosecutors who worked the case later described the interagency coordination as among the most logistically complex they had encountered in the region. There were disagreements about jurisdiction. There were bureaucratic delays. There were moments when the case nearly fractured along institutional lines. That it held together was a function of the documentary strength of the evidence and the sustained commitment of the DEA FBI task force that had been running the investigation since the mid-1990s. Redmond was arrested in Shreveport in the spring of 1997. The arrest drew local media attention, not because the community was entirely surprised, but because the scale of what was alleged caught many people off guard. Neighbors who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the man described in the indictment with the man they had seen at neighborhood events, at church functions, at small business gatherings. This cognitive dissonance is not unusual in cases of this type. It is in fact a structural feature of how organizations like Redmond's sustain themselves. They require a certain amount of community normalcy as cover, and maintaining that cover requires genuine engagement, not performance, but real presence. The people who found him difficult to reconcile with his charges were not being naive. They were responding accurately to one half of a deliberately divided reality. The trial, which took place in federal court in Shreveport in 1998, lasted several weeks. The government presented a case built on the convergence of the cooperating witness testimony, the telephone record analysis, the fingerprint evidence, the financial records, and the corroborating accounts of additional witnesses. The defense contested each element: the reliability of cooperating witnesses, the chain of custody on physical evidence, the inferential leap required to connect pattern evidence to criminal intent. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a verdict of guilty on the lead conspiracy count and multiple additional counts related to drug distribution and money laundering. The sentence handed down by the federal district judge was 43 years. At the time, it was reported as the largest drug conspiracy conviction in the history of Shreveport's federal court. The sentence was structured under mandatory minimum provisions applicable to the quantities involved, combined with enhancements for the leadership role Redmond had played in the organization and for the multi-state scope of the conspiracy. The organizations that had depended on Redmond's supply did not simply collapse. Several of his wholesale customers had already been prosecuted or were prosecuted in the wake of his arrest. Others adjusted their supply relationships, found other sources, restructured their networks. The street-level consequence of disrupting a wholesale distribution operation of this scale is rarely total elimination. It is disruption and reorganization. The cocaine kept moving. Different hands moved it. The jurisdictional fault lines that Redmond had exploited remained largely in place for years afterward, though the case did eventually prompt some degree of improved intelligence sharing between the three state agencies involved. Several of Redmond's associates received significant federal sentences of their own as part of the broader prosecution. The cooperating witness whose testimony formed the backbone of the government's case received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, the terms of which were disclosed to the jury as required. Calvin Pryor, whose 1993 arrest had indirectly launched the thread that eventually led to Redmond, cooperated as well and served a reduced term. The logistics coordinator identified in connection with the Bossier City storage facility was convicted at a separate proceeding. Darius Redmond, for his part, maintained his innocence through trial and through the initial appeals process. His attorneys pursued post-conviction relief on several grounds, none of which produced a reversal of the conviction. He entered federal custody in 1998. What lingers about a story like this, beyond the institutional facts, beyond the charges and the sentences, is the psychology. The operating theory behind Redmond's organization was not simply greed. Greed is too simple a word and too simple a motive to explain the architectural precision of what he built. What drove it was something closer to a theory of systems, a belief that institutions are predictable, that their boundaries are exploitable, and that a sufficiently disciplined operator can move through the negative space between them indefinitely. He was not entirely wrong about the institutions. The jurisdictional gaps he identified were real. The intelligence failures he exploited were genuine. The law enforcement agencies involved in the eventual prosecution were honest enough in retrospect to acknowledge that the gaps had existed and that they had been exploited for years before anyone assembled a complete picture. But the theory had a flaw that Redmond's intelligence couldn't account for. Systems evolve. Not quickly, not elegantly, but under sufficient pressure, especially the pressure of a case whose scope eventually forced 3 U.S. attorneys' offices to cooperate in ways they never had before. Institutions can adapt. The same geographic position that made Shreveport a distribution hub made the eventual federal case a matter of serious institutional priority. When 3 districts are simultaneously affected by the same criminal network, at some point the bureaucratic friction that protects that network becomes politically and professionally unsustainable. The system catches up. It always takes longer than it should, but it catches up. We opened with the question of how far a human being will go when they believe that geography and institutional blindness are permanently on their side. Darius Redmond went very far, farther than most, and with more sophistication than most. And the answer, ultimately, is that the distance a person travels in that direction does not insulate them from consequence. It deepens it. Every year of operation was another year of evidence accumulating in fragments across 3 states, waiting for the moment when someone would gather those fragments into a coherent whole. Every wholesale transaction, every crossed state line, every call made on a phone that was supposed to be untraceable, all of it became, eventually, the material of a 43-year federal sentence in a courtroom in Shreveport. The streets he built his empire on are still there. They still run through Cedar Grove and Allendale and across the Red River into Bossier City. The interstates still converge. The geography hasn't changed. What changed was the will to see it whole, and the institutional machinery to act on what was seen.